My name is Rose-Helene Spreiregen. I am a Holocaust survivor, a museum volunteer. I was born in Paris, France on March 6, 1931. My family had immigrated from Poland in the late 1920s because of rampant anti-Semitism and violent attacks against Jews. My parents met in Paris in 1929 and were married shortly thereafter. Unfortunately, they separated when I was an infant, so I lived with my mother and grandmother and sometimes in foster homes. When I was 5, my mother sent me to live in a border school for Jewish children in the small town of Lucienne in the western suburbs of Paris, and I went to school in town along with the other children. Because my mother couldn't afford the cost of the boarding house, I sometimes had to leave Lucienne and return home to Paris. On those occasions, I recall adults talking about the threat of war with Germany. World War II began when Germany invaded Poland. Fearing bombings and gas attacks, the authorities in Paris decided to evacuate the elderly and children. So it was that I, along with my grandmother and younger cousin Bernard, was sent to Savigny-sur-Bray, a town well southeast of Paris. During our 8 months in Savigny-sur-Bray, my cousin and I went to school and life had a semblance of normality. But that changed abruptly in May 1940, when Germany invaded Western Europe. The roads soon became filled with refugees fleeing Nazi occupation in Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Western France. They brought with them whatever they could, their belongings packed onto bicycles or carriages or horse-drawn wagons. The roads were lined with abandoned cars that had run out of fuel. Many people simply walked with whatever they could carry. I remember my grandmother offering them bread and water, anything she could spare. German attack airplanes often strafed these columns of refugees in order to cause congestion and chaos, obstructing the mobility of the collapsing French army. It was during that time that my mother came to visit, but in one of the air attacks, she received a wound to the foot. She had to return to Paris for medical help, and I went with her. The journey was extremely difficult as we navigated roads packed with people and avoided bombing and raids by sheltering in ditches along the road. It remains indelible in my memory. We managed to get to Paris, where she received treatment. Paris was now occupied by the Germans. Towards the end of 1940, all Jews were required to register themselves with the French police, who were collaborating with the German occupiers. It didn't take long for anti-Semitic legislation and daily acts of discrimination to begin. Jews were forbidden to go to restaurants, parks, or movie theaters. They could not possess a radio or telephone. A 6 p.m. curfew was instituted. In May 1941, the French police began arresting and deporting Jewish men of foreign nationality, including a number of my uncles and cousins. They were detained in internment camps at Compiègne, Pithiviers, and Bonne-la-Rolande for over 13 months before being detained at Drancy and transferred elsewhere. They never returned. By 1942, Every Jew 6 years of age and older was issued 3 yellow stars of David, inscribed with the French word for Jew, juif. The star had to be sewn, not pinned, on the left side of an outer garment and was to be clearly visible at all times. The anti-Semitic legislations continued to worsen. Jews could only go grocery shopping with their Russian tickets for 1 hour each day. The lines were long, and all too often, by the time one entered the shop, the food was sold out. Jews were required to travel in the last car of the metro subway trains. They were not allowed to travel further than 25 kilometers, 17 miles from Paris. I stopped going to school entirely in July 1942 because Jewish children were being pulled out of their classrooms and deported to killing centers. That same month, French police arrested more than 13,000 Jews in Paris, interning them for several days under horrendous conditions in the Velodrome d'Hiver sport arena before they were deported. Luckily, a local policeman who also happened to be a friend of my mother's had warned her about the roundup and advised her not to remain in her apartment. She immediately went into hiding. My mother decided to try to flee to Vichy, France, the unoccupied zone in the southern part of the country. She obtained false identity papers and was able to find someone who could smuggle her across the border. Tragically, the smuggler betrayed my mother and the group of friends she was traveling with. The entire group was arrested and transported to Drancy. My mother's plan had been to send for my grandmother and me after she found a place to live in the free zone. Instead, my grandmother and I moved to my mother's vacant apartment. My mother had taken most of our money, but with the very little we had left, we bribed the concierge to say that my mother had been deported and that her apartment was empty. My grandmother remained in the apartment for over a year, never once leaving for fear of arrest and deportation. I was in charge of all outside chores. Every day I stood in interminable lines to try to buy food using our Russian tickets. I remember standing in line with my yellow Star of David visible, even though I attempted to conceal it, and being cursed with ugly anti-Semitic insults such as dirty Jew and kike. From our apartment, we could observe 2 streets. On some nights, we saw police arrest Jewish families who were hiding in our neighborhood. We never knew if someone might denounce us, reveal our presence, and if we'd be arrested. We sometimes slept in the attic to be extra careful. Fear was overwhelming and ever present. There were many close calls during this time. We couldn't jeopardize our hiding place by going to a bomb shelter during air raids, so we remained in the apartment at great personal risk. Police officers often arrested Jewish passengers who were easily identified by the yellow stars as they exited the subway stations. On several occasions, as I was about to exit the station, I saw people being arrested. To avoid arrest, I would quickly slip back down into the station and onto another train. Other times, I was lucky enough to find my way to an exit that was safe. I always had to be prepared. I was always frightened I was just 11 years old. In August 1943, my grandmother realized that we couldn't remain in Paris. We were determined to join my aunt and cousin, who had successfully made the journey south to the free zone. They were living in the town of Floiron in southeast France, near the Swiss border. We obtained false identity papers from the French underground and spent time memorizing our new names, dates of birth, and other personal information. This was very difficult for my grandmother, since her French was quite poor. We only spoke Yiddish to each other. We left on an overnight train that took us through two border control checkpoints. The first was on the German command, the second, French. This was especially dangerous since my grandmother spoke little French and still had a strong Polish accent. I decided that it would be best that my grandmother pretends to be asleep. I would handle the papers at the checkpoints. When the German border control guard came, I told him that my grandmother was asleep and asked that he not awake her. It worked, and we passed. At the second checkpoint, there was a French border control guard. I did the same thing, and again we passed. This experience, among the many I had in those terrible years, was the most terrifying of all. I shook uncontrollably for hours after the encounters. Instead of being taken care of by an adult, I had become the adult in charge. I was 12 years old. In Voiron, we reunited with my aunt and cousin, but it would have been too risky to stay together. We finally found a place in what I call as a sort of warehouse. We had no furniture, but a kind neighbor lent us a mattress, some cooking utensils, and a stove that served both for cooking and heating. There was only cold running water. At the end of a long corridor was a toilet. We obtained wooden boxes to store our few belongings. One of my prized possessions at the time was a woolen dress made for me from a plaid blanket, the only warm dress I had. Its center was soon eaten away by mice, totally destroyed. After we settled in, I found a job managing a small grocery store. Since we lived about 3 miles away from the store, the owner, who was ill with tuberculosis, lent me a bicycle. The journey to and from work was difficult as the terrain was mountainous, the roads were narrow and unlit, and it was the dead of winter. My wages did not provide enough to sustain us. The grandmother sewed and mended things by hand and bartered for food, a little cheese, a little meat, anything to complement our meager rations. Often we traded our own rations of wine and chocolate for staples like milk. The nearby forest also provided sustenance. The collected chestnuts, walnuts, and fallen tree branches to use for cooking and heating. To add to our travails, one day my grandmother fell and broke 2 ribs. Aside from the pain, she could heal only by lying in bed for several weeks. Not only did I again have to do everything for the 2 of us, I was further terrified by the realization that my grandmother was immobile, that it would have been impossible for us to flee had we been further threatened. we were stuck in place, but we continued to survive. Liberation finally came at the end of August 1944, thanks to the American army. It was a joyous time. The soldiers gave us crackers, chocolate, and of all things, chewing gum, something I never knew existed. We thought that our liberation was the end of our nightmare and we'd be able to return to Paris right away. I fantasized that I could finally have some of the food I had been craving for years: sardines, steak, French fries, oranges, bananas, a traditional French baguette. None of these had been available during the war. But this hope was not to be realized so quickly. Many railroad tracks and trains had been destroyed by bombing. We had to wait almost 3 months until November 1944 before we could get a train back to Paris. As for food, rationing lasted for a very long time after liberation. My food dreams were put on hold. But I was free. Free! The years of fear lay behind me, the time for hope ahead. Returning to Paris, we found that my grandmother's apartment had been completely looted. Gone were family photos and the precious family prayer books that my grandmother had brought from Poland years before. Gone was my prized possession, the beautiful book I'd received in 1939 at boarding school as a special prize. The apartment had been rented to someone else, even though we had paid the rent for the entire time we were gone. It took a couple of years before it was returned to us. I still had no knowledge of my mother's fate, nor that of my other relatives. I kept hoping for her return and the return of the others. Like many French people, I tried to obtain information, but none was available. She never returned. It was not until much later that we learned what happened to her. My mother had stayed in Drancy only a few days before volunteering to accompany a group of children on a transport to Auschwitz. The children and the adults who volunteered to travel with them were packed into freight cars without water, food, or sanitation. There was no place to even sit, let alone lie. My mother's journey occurred in the heat of August. Those who didn't die en route were gassed immediately upon arrival. Such was my mother's fate. She was only 31 years old. As for me, I could only go forward. I went back to school as soon as I returned to Paris and earned my high school diploma in just a few months, even after having been away from school nearly 2.5 years. Sadly, I was unable to continue my education to university, needing to earn money for rent and food. Eventually, I found a position at a bank and attended night school. I was all of 16 years old. I am compelled to tell my story because the increasing rise of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, it brings back so many terrible memories. People must know what happened and what can still happen if we do not stand up for others. Indeed, it has been happening again to other ethnic groups in different parts of the world. I feel obligated to share my first-hand experiences of such horrors so that the world can understand the effect of conflict on a small child. My dear late friend Charlene Schiff, also a survivor and longtime beloved Holocaust Museum volunteer, gave the simplest and clearest understanding of how such catastrophes as the Holocaust happened. She called it the four I's: indifference, ignorance, injustice, and intolerance. We must remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered, and we must speak out and act on behalf of all those who face the threat of mass atrocities and genocide today.